have struck him in answer to such a word, had he felt equal to it. "She asked me to bury her today on the hill above the house, where I went to meet her by appointment. Here, I'll prove it to you. Read this." Whilst he was speaking, he had opened his grey coat and was fumbling in the breast pocket of his coat. He produced a letter which he handed to Harold, who took it with trembling hand. By this time the reins had fallen slack, and the horse was walking quietly. There was moonlight, but not enough to read by. Harold bent over and tilted the driving lamp next to him and turned it so that he could read the envelope. He could hardly keep either lamp or paper still. His hand trembled, so when he saw that the direction was in Stephen's handwriting, he was handing it back when Leonard said again, "Open it, read it. You must do so. I tell you, you must. You called me a liar, and now must read the proof that I'm not. If you don't, I shall have to ask Stephen to make you." Before Harold's mind flashed a rapid thought of what the girl might suffer in being asked to take part in such a quarrel. He could not himself even act in the best advantage unless he knew the truth. He took the letter from the envelope and held it before the lamp, the paper fluttering as though in a breeze from the trembling of his hand. Leonard looked on. The dull glare of his eyes brightened with malignant pleasure as he beheld the other's concern. He owed him a grudge, and, by God, he would pay it. Had he not been struck, throttled, called a liar? As he read the words, Harold's face cleared. "Why, you infernal young scoundrel," he said angrily. "That letter is nothing but a simple note from a young girl to an old friend, playmate, asking him to come to see her about some trivial thing, and you construe it into a proposal of marriage? You hound!" He held the letter whilst he spoke, heedless of the outstretched hand of the other waiting to take it back. There was a dangerous glitter in Leonard's eyes. He knew his man, and he knew the truth of what he had himself said, and he felt, with all the strength of his base soul, how best he could torture him, in the very strength of Harold's anger, in the poignancy of his concern, in the relief to his soul expressed in his eyes and his voice. His antagonist realized the jealousy of one who honors and loves. Second by second, Leonard grew more sober and better able to carry his own idea into act. "Give me my letter," he began. "Wait," said Harold, as he put the lamp back in its socket. "That will do presently. Take back what you said just now." "What? Take back what?" "That base lie that Miss Norman asked you to marry her." Leonard felt that in a physical struggle for the possession of the letter he would be outmatched, but his passion grew colder and more malignant, and in a voice that cut like the hiss of a snake, he spoke slowly and deliberately. He was all sober now. The drunkenness of brain and blood was lost, for the time, in the strength of his cold passion. "It is true. By God, it is true. Every word of it. That letter, which you want to steal, is only a proof that I went to meet her on Caister Hill, by her own appointment. When I got there, she was waiting for me. She began to talk about a chalet there, and at first I didn't know what she meant." There was such a conviction, such a triumphant truth in his voice that Harold was convinced. "Stop," he thundered. "Stop. Don't tell me anything. I don't want to hear. I don't want to know." He covered his face with his hands and groaned. It was not as though the speaker were a stranger, in which case he would had been by now well on in his death by strangulation. He had known Leonard all his life, and he was a friend of Stephen's, and he was speaking truth. The baleful glitter of Leonard's eyes grew brighter still. He was as a serpent when he goes to strike. In this wise he struck. "I shall not stop. I shall go on and tell you all I choose. You have called me liar twice. You have also called me other names. Now you shall hear the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And if you won't listen to me, someone else will." Harold groaned again. Leonard's eyes brightened still more, and the evil smile on his face grew broader as he began more and more to feel his power. He went on to speak with a cold, deliberate malignancy, but instinctively, so sticking to absolute truth that he could trust himself to hurt most. The other listened, cold at heart and physically. His veins and arteries seemed stagnant. "I won't tell you anything of her pretty embarrassments, how her voice fell as she pleaded, how she blushed and stammered. Why, even I, who am used to women and their pretty ways and their passions and their flushes and their stormy upbraidings, didn't quite know for a while what she was driving at. So at last she spoke out, pretty plainly, and told me what a fond wife she'd make me if I would only take her." Harold said nothing. He only rocked a little, as one in pain, and his hands fell. The other went on. "That is what happened this morning on Caister Hill, under the trees where I met Stephen Norman by her own appointment. Honestly, what happened? If you don't believe me now, you can ask Stephen. My Stephen," he added in a final burst of venom, as in a gleam of moonlight, through a rift in the shadowy wood he saw the ghastly pallor of Harold's face. Then he added abruptly, as he held out his hand, "Now, give me my letter." In the last few seconds Harold had been thinking, and as he had been thinking for the good, the safety of Stephen, his thoughts flew swift and true. This man's very tone, the openness of his malignity, the underlying scorn when he spoke of her whom others worshipped, showed him the danger, the terrible immediate danger in which she stood from such a man, with the instinct of a mind working as truly for the woman he loved as the needle does to the pole. He spoke quietly, throwing a sneer into the tone so as to exasperate his companion. It was brain against brain now, and for Stephen's sake. "And of course, you accepted. You naturally would." The other fell into the trap. He could not help giving an extra dig to his opponent by proving him once more the wrong. "Oh, no, I didn't. Stephen is a fine girl, but she wants taking down a bit. She's too high and mighty just at present, and wants to boss a chap too much. I mean, to be master in my own house, and she's got to begin as she will have to go on. I'll let her wait a bit, and then I'll yield by degrees to her love-making. She's a fine girl, for all her red hair, and she won't be so bad after all." Harold listened, chilled, into still and silent amazement. To hear Stephen spoken of in such a way appalled him. She, of all women. Leonard never knew how near sudden death he was as he lay back in his seat, his eyes getting dull against his chin, sinking. The drunkenness which had been arrested by the passion was reasserting itself. Harold saw his state in time and arrested his own movement to take him by the throat and dash him to the ground. Even as he looked at him in scornful hate, the cart gave a lurch and Leonard fell forward. Instinctively, Harold swept an arm round him and held him up. As he did so, the unconsciousness of arrested sleep came. Leonard's chin sank on his breast, and he breathed stertorously. As he drove on, Harold's thoughts circled in a tumult. Vague ideas of extreme measures which he ought to take flashed up and paled away. Intention revolved upon itself till its weak side was exposed, and it was abandoned. He could not doubt the essential truth of Leonard's statement regarding the proposal of marriage. He did not understand this, nor did he try to. His own love for the girl and the bitter awaking to its futility made him so hopeless that in his own desolation all the mystery of her doing and the cause of it was merged and lost. His only aim and purpose now was her safety. One thing at least he could do, by fair means or foul, stop Leonard's mouth, so that others need not know her shame. He groaned aloud as the thought came to him. Beyond this first step, he could do nothing, think of nothing as yet, and he could not take the first step till Leonard had so far sobered that he could understand. And so, waiting for that time to come, he drove on through the silent night. Chapter 13. Harold's Resolve. As they went on their way, Harold noticed that Leonard's breathing became more regular, as in honest sleep. He therefore drove slowly, so that the other might be sane again before they should arrive at the gate of his father's place. He had something of importance to say before they should part. Seeing him sleeping so peacefully, Harold passed a strap round him to prevent him falling from his seat. Then he could let his thoughts run more freely. Her safety was his immediate concern. Again and again he thought over what he should say to Leonard to ensure his silence. Whilst he was pondering with set brows, he was startled by Leonard's voice at his side. "Is that you, Harold? I must have been asleep." Harold remained silent, amazed at the change. Leonard went on, quite awake and coherent. "By George, I must have been pretty well cut. I don't remember a thing after coming down the stairs of the club and you and the hall porter helping me up here. I say, old chap, you have strapped me up, all safe and tight. It was good of you to take charge of me. I hope I haven't been a beastly nuisance." Harold answered grimly, "It wasn't exactly what I should have called it." Then, after looking keenly at his companion, he said, "Are you quite awake and sober now?" "Quite," the answer came definitely. There was something in his question's tone which was militant and aggressive. Before speaking further, Harold pulled up the horse. They were now crossing bare moorland, where anything within a mile could have easily been seen. They were quite alone, and would be undisturbed. Then he turned to his companion. "You talked a good deal in your drunken sleep, if sleep it was." "You appeared to be awake," Leonard answered. "I don't remember anything of it. What did I say?" "I'm going to tell you. You said something so strange and so wrong that you must answer for it. But first, I must know its truth." "Must? You are pretty dictatorial," said Leonard angrily. "Must answer for it? What do you mean? Were you on Caister Hill today? What's that to you?" There was no mistaking the defiant, quarrelsome intent. "Answer me. Were you?" Harold's voice was strong and calm. "What if I was? It's none of your affair. Did I say anything in what you have politely called my drunken sleep?" "You did. What did I say?" "I shall tell you in time, but I must know the truth as I proceed. There is someone else concerned in this, and I must know as I go on. You can easily judge by what I say if I am right." "Then ask away, and be damned to you." Harold's calm voice seemed to quell the other's turbulence as he went on. "Were you on Caister Hill this morning?" "I was." "Did you meet a lady there?" "What? I did." "Was it by appointment?" Some sort of idea, or half-recollection, seemed to come to Leonard. He fumbled half-consciously in his breast-pocket. Then he broke out angrily. "You have taken my letter." "I know the answer to the question," said Harold slowly. "You showed me the letter yourself, and insisted on my reading it." Leonard's heart began to quail. He seemed to have an instinctive dread of what was coming. Harold went on calmly and remorselessly. "Did a proposal of marriage pass between you?" "Yes." The answer was definitely given. Leonard began to feel that his back was against the wall. "Who made it?" The answer was a sudden attempt at a blow, but Harold struck down his hand in time and held it. Leonard, though a fairly strong man, was powerless in that iron grasp. "You must answer. It is necessary that I know the truth." "Why must you? What have you to do with it? You are not my keeper, nor Stephen's, though I dare say you would like to be." The insult cooled Harold's rising passion, even whilst it wrung his heart. "I have to do with it because I choose. You may find the answer, if you wish, in your last insult. Now, clearly, understand me, Leonard Everard. You know me of old, and you know that what I say I shall do. One way or another, your life or mine may be hung on your answers to me, if necessary." Leonard felt himself pulled up. He knew well the strength and purpose of the man. With a light laugh, which he felt to be, as it was, hollow, he answered, "Well, schoolmaster, as you are asking questions, I suppose I may as well answer them. Go on. Next." Harold went on in the same calm, cold voice. "Who made the proposal of marriage?" "She did." "Did? Was it made at once and directly, or after some preliminary suggestion?" "After a bit. I didn't quite understand at first what she was driving at." There was a long pause. With an effort, Harold went on. "Did you accept?" Leonard hesitated. With a really wicked scowl, he eyed his big, powerfully built companion. who still had his hand as in a vice. Then, seeing no resource, he answered, "I did not. That does not mean that I won't, though," he added, defiantly. To his surprise, Harold suddenly released his hand. There was a grimace in his tone as he said, "That will do. I know now that you have spoken the truth. Sober as well as drunk. You need say no more. I know the rest. Most men, even brutes like you, if there are any, would have been ashamed even to think the things you said openly to me. You hound. You vile, traitorous, mean-souled hound. What did I say? I know what you said, and I shall not forget it," he went on, his voice deepening into a stern, judicial utterance, as though he were pronouncing a sentence of death. "Leonard Everard, you have treated vilely a lady whom I love and honour more than I love my own soul. You have insulted her to her face and behind her back. You have made such disloyal reference to her and to her mad act in so trusting you, and have so shown your intention of causing, intentionally or unintentionally, woe to her, that I tell you here and now that you hold henceforth your life in your hand. If you ever mention to a living soul what you have told me twice tonight, even though you should be then her husband, if you should cause her harm, though she should then be your wife, if you cause her dishonour in public or in private, I shall kill you. So help me God." Not a word more did he say, but taking up the reins, drove on in silence till they arrived at the gate of Brindhow, where he signed to him to alight. He drove off in silence. When he arrived at his own house, he sent the servant to bed, and then went to his study, where he locked himself in. Then, and then only, did he permit his thoughts to have full range. For the first time since the blow had fallen, he looked straight in the face the change in his own life. He had loved Stephen so long and so honestly that it seemed to him now as if that love had been the very foundation of his life. He could not remember a time when he had not loved her, away back to the time when he, a big boy, took her, a little girl, under his care, and devoted himself to her. He had grown into the belief that so strong and so consistent an affection, though he had never spoken it or even hinted at it or inferred it, had become a part of her life as well as of his own, and this was the end of that dreaming. Not only did she not care for him, but found herself with a heart so empty that she needs must propose marriage to another man. There was surely something more than at present he knew of or could understand behind such an act done by her. Why should she ask Everard to marry her? Why should she ask any man? Women didn't do such things. Here he paused. Women didn't do such things. All at once there came back to him fragments of discussions in which Stephen had a part, in which matters of convention had been dealt with. Out of these dim and shattered memories came a comfort to his heart, though his brain could not as yet grasp the reason of it. He knew that Stephen had held an unconventional idea as to the equality of the sexes. Was it possible that she was indeed testing one of her theories? The idea stirred him so that he could not remain quiet. He stood up and walked the room. Somehow he felt light beginning to dawn, though he could not tell its source or guess at the final measure of its fullness. The fact of Stephen having done such a thing was hard to bear, but it was harder to think that she should have done such a thing without a motive, or, worse, with love of Leonard as a motive. He shuddered as he paused. She could not love such a man. It was monstrous. And yet she had done this thing. Oh, if she had had anyone to advise her, to restrain her! But she had no mother. No mother. Poor Stephen! The pity of it, not for himself, but for the woman he loved, overcame him. Sitting down heavily before his desk, he put his face on his hands, and his great shoulders shook. Long after the violence of his emotion had passed, he sat there motionless, thinking with all the power and sincerity he knew, thinking for Stephen's good. When a strong man thinks unselfishly, some good may come out of it. He may blunder, but the conclusion of his reasoning must be in the main right. So it was with Harold. He knew that he was ignorant of women, and of women's nature, as distinguished from man's. The only woman he had ever known well was Stephen, and she, in her youth and in her ignorance of the world and herself, was hardly sufficient to supply him data for his present needs. To a clean-minded man of his age, a woman is something divine. It is only when in later life disappointment and experience have hammered bitter truth into his brain that he begins to realize that woman is not angelic but human. When he knows more and finds that she is like himself, human and limited, but with qualities of purity and sincerity and endurance which put his own to shame, he realizes how much better a helpmate she is for man than could be the vague, unreal creations of his dreams. And then he can thank God for his goodness that when he might have given us angels, he did give us women. But that would never be. The past could not be blotted out. All he could do would be to serve her. He would go early. Such a man as Leonard Everard might make some new complication, and the present was quite bad enough. It was a poor enough thing for him, he thought at length. She might trample on him, but it was for her sake, and for him what did it matter? The worst had come. All was over now. Chapter 14. The Beech Grove. On the morning following the proposal, Stephen strolled out into a beech grove, some little distance from the house, which from childhood had been a favourite haunt of hers. It was not in the immediate road to anywhere, and so there was no occasion for any of the household or the garden to go through it or near it. She did not put on a hat, but took only a sunshade, which she used in passing over the lawn. The grove was on the side of the house, away from her own room and the breakfast room. When she had reached its shade, she felt that at last she was alone. The grove was a privileged place. Long ago, a great number of young beeches had been planted so thickly that as they grew, they shot up straight and branchless in their struggle for the light. Not till they had reached a considerable altitude had they been thinned, and then the thinning had been so effected that, as the high branches began to shoot out in the freer space, they met in time and interlaced so closely that they made in many places a perfect screen of leafy shade. Here and there were rifts or openings through which the light passed. Under such places the grass was fine and green, or the wild hyacinths in dew season tinged the earth with blue. Through the groove some wide alleys had been left, great broad walks where the soft grass grew short and fine, and to those edges came a drooping of branches, an upspringing of undergrowth, of laurel and rhododendron. At the far ends of these walks were little pavilions of marble, built in the classic style which ruled for garden use 200 years ago. At the near ends, some of them were close to the broad stretch of water, and from whose edges ran back the great sloping banks of emerald sward, dotted here and there with great forest trees. The grove was protected by a ha-ha, so that it was never invaded from without, and the servants of the house, both the domestic and the gardeners and grooms, had been always forbidden to enter it. Thus, by long usage, it had become a place of quiet and solitude for the members of the family. To this soothing spot had come Stephen in her pain. The long spell of self-restraint during that morning had almost driven her to frenzy, and she sought solitude as an anodyne to her tortured soul. The long anguish of a third sleepless night, following on a day of humiliation and terror, had destroyed for a time the natural resilience of a healthy nature. She had been for so long in the prison of her own purpose, with fear as warder. The fetters of conversational life had so gallied her that here, in the accustomed solitude of this place, in which from childhood she had been used to move and think freely, she felt as does a captive who has escaped from a irksome durance. As Stephen had all along been free of movement and speech, no such opportunities of freedom called to her. The pent-up passion in her, however, found its own relief. Her voice was silent, and she moved with slow steps, halting often between the green tree trunks in the cool shade, but her thoughts ran free, and passion found a vent. No stranger, seeing the tall, queenly girl moving slowly through the trees, could have imagined the fierce passion which blazed within her, unless he had been close enough to see her eyes. The habit of physical restraint to which all her life she had been accustomed, and which was intensified by the experience of the past 36 hours, still ruled her, even here. Gradually the habits of security began to prevail, and the shackles to melt away. Here had she come in all her childish troubles. Here had she fought with herself and conquered herself. Here the spirits of the place were with her and not against her. Here memory in its second-degree habit gave her the full sense of spiritual freedom. As she walked to and fro, the raging of her spirit changed its objective, from restraint to its final causes, and chief amongst them the pride which had been so grievously hurt. How she loathed the day that had passed, and how more than all she had hated herself for her part in it. Her mad, foolish, idiotic self-importance which gave her the idea of such an act and urged her to the bitter end of its carrying out, her mulish obstinacy in persisting when every fibre of her being had revolted at the doing, and when deep in her innermost soul was a deterring sense of its futility. How could she have stopped to have done such a thing, to ask a man? Oh, the shame of it! The shame of it all! How could she have been so blind as to think that such a man was worthy? In the midst of her whirlwind of passion came a solitary gleam of relief. She knew with certainty that she did not love Leonard, that she had never loved him. The coldness of disdain to him, the fear of his future acts, which was based on disbelief of the existence of that finer nature with which she had credited him, all proved to her convincingly that he could never really have been within the charmed circle of her inner life. Did she but know it! Did she but know it! There was an even stronger evidence of her indifference to him in the ready manner in which her thoughts flew past him in their circling sweep. For a moment she saw him as the centre of a host of besetting fears, but her own sense of superior power nullified the force of the vision. She was able to cope with him and his doings, were there such a need, and so her mind flew back to the personal side of her trouble, her blindness, her folly, her shame. In truth, she was doing good work for herself. Her mind was working truly and to a beneficent end. One by one, she was overcoming the false issues of her passion and drifting to an end in which she would see herself face to face and would place so truly the blame for what had been as to make it a warning and ennobling lesson of her life. She moved more quickly, passing to and fro, as does a panther in its cage, when the desire of forest freedom is heavy upon it. That which makes the irony of life will perhaps never be understood in its casual aspect by the finite mind of a man. The why and wherefore and the how of it is only to be understood by that all-wise intelligence which can scan the future as well as the present and see the far-reaching ramifications of those schemes of final development to which the manifestation of completed character tend. To any moral, it would seem a pity that to Stephen, in her solitude, when her passion was working itself out to an end which might be good, should come an interruption which would throw it back upon itself in such a way as to multiply its malignant force. But again, it is a part of the great plan that instruments whose use man's finite mind could never predicate should be employed, the seeming good to evil, the seeming evil to good. As she swept to and fro, her raging spirit compelling to violent movement, Stephen's eyes were arrested by the figure of a man coming through the aisles of the grove. At such a time, any interruption of her passion was a cause of heightened anger, but the presence of a person was as a draught to a full-fed furnace. Most of all, in her present condition of mind, the presence of a man, for the thought of a man, lay behind all her trouble was as a tornado striking a burning forest. The blood of her tortured heart seemed to leap to her brain and to suffuse her eyes. She saw blood. It mattered not that the man whom she saw she knew and trusted. Indeed, this but added fuel to the flame. In the presence of a stranger, some of her habitual self-restraint would doubtless have come back to her, but now the necessity for such was foregone. Harold was her alter ego, and in his presence was safety. He was in this aspect but a higher and more intelligent rendering of the trees around her. In another aspect, he was an opportune victim, something to strike at. When the anger of a poison snake opens its gland, and the fang is charged with venom, it must strike at something. It does not pause or consider what it may be. It strikes, though it may be a stone or iron. So Stephen waited till her victim was within distance to strike, her black eyes fierce with passion and blood-rimmed as cobras, glittering as he passed among the tree trunks towards her, eager with his errand of devotion. Harold was a man of strong purpose. If he had not been, he would never have come on his present errand. Never, perhaps, had any suitor set forth on his quest with a heavier heart. All his life, since his very boyhood, had been centered round the girl whom today he had come to serve. All his thought had been for her, and today all he could expect was a gentle denial of all his hopes, so that his future life would be at best a blank. But he would be serving Stephen. His pain might be to her good, ought it to be, to a certain extent, to her mental ease. Her wounded pride would find some solace. As he came closer, the feeling that he had to play a part, veritably to act one, came stronger and stronger upon him, and filled him with bitter doubt as to his power. Still, he went on boldly. It had been a part of his plan to seem to come eagerly, as a lover should come, and so he came. When he got close to Stephen, all the witchery of her presence came upon him as of old. After all, he loved her with his whole soul, and the chance had come to tell her so. Even under the distressing conditions of his suit, the effort had its charm. Stephen schooled herself to her usual attitude with him, and that, too, since the effort was based on truth, came with a certain ease to her. At the present time, in her present frame of mind, nothing in the wide world could give her pleasure. The ease which came, if it did not change her purpose, increased her power. Their usual salutation begun when she was a little baby was, "Good morning, Stephen. Good morning, Harold." It had become so much a custom that now it came mechanically on her part. The tender reference to childhood's days, though it touched her companion to the quick, did not appeal to her, since she had no special thought of it. Had such a thought come to her, it might have softened her, even to tears, for Harold had been always deep in her heart. As might have been expected from her character and condition of mind, she was the first to begin. I suppose you want to see me about something special, Harold. You have come so early. Yes, Stephen, very special. Were you at the house? She asked, in a voice whose quietness might have conveyed a warning. She was so suspicious now that she suspected even Harold of what she did not know. He answered in all simplicity. No, I came straight here. How did you know I should be here? Her voice was now not only quiet but sweet. Without thinking, Harold blundered on. His intention was so single-minded, and his ignorance of women so complete, that he did not recognize even elementary truths. I knew you always came here long ago, when you were a child, when you were in... Here it suddenly flashed upon him that if he seemed to expect that she was in trouble, as he had proposed saying, he would give away his knowledge of what had happened, and so destroy the work to which he had set himself. So he finished the sentence in a lame and impotent manner, which, however, saved complete annihilation, as it was verbally accurate in short frocks. Stephen needed to know little more. Her quick intelligence grasped the fact that there was some purpose afoot which she did not know or understand. She surmised, of course, that it was some way in connection with her mad act, and she grew cooler in her brain as well as cooler in her heart as she prepared to learn more. Stephen had changed from girl to woman in the last 24 hours, and all the woman in her was now awake. After a moment's pause, she said with a winning smile, "Why, Harold, I've been in long frocks for years. Why should I come here on this special day on that account?" Even as she was speaking, she felt that it would be well to abandon this ground of inquiry. It had clearly told her all it could. She would learn more by some other means. So she went on in a playful way, as a cat, not a kitten, does when it has got a mouse. "That reason won't work, Harold. It's quite rusty in its joints, but never mind it. Tell me why you have come so early." This seemed to Harold to be a heaven-sent opening. He rushed in at once. "Because, Stephen, I wanted to ask you to be my wife." "Oh, Stephen, don't you know that I love you ever since you were a little girl? When you were a little girl and I a big boy, I loved you. I have loved you ever since with all my heart and soul and strength. Without you, the world is a blank to me. For you and your happiness, I would do anything, anything." This was no acting. When once the barrier of beginning had been broken, his soul seemed to pour itself out. The man was vibrant through all its nature, and the woman's very soul realized its truth. For an instant, a flame of gladness swept through her, and for the time it lasted, put all other thought aside. But suspicion is a hard metal which does not easily yield to fire. It can come to white heat easily enough, but its melting point is high indeed. When the flame had leaped, it had spent its force. The reaction came quick. Stephen's heart seemed to turn to ice. All the heat and life rushed to her brain. Her thoughts flashed with convincing quickness. There was no time for doubting amid their rush. Her life was, for good or ill, at the crossing of the ways. She had trusted Harold thoroughly. The habit of her whole life, from her babyhood up had been to so look to him as comrade and protector and sympathetic friend. She was so absolutely sure of his earnest devotion that this new experience of a riper feeling would have been a joy to her. If it should be that his act was all spontaneous and done in ignorance of her shame, shame was the genetic word which now summarized to herself her thought of her conduct in proposing to Leonard. But of this she must be certain. She could not, dare not, go further till this was settled. With the same craving for certainty with which she convinced herself that Leonard understood her overtures, and with the same dogged courage with which she pressed the matter on him, she now went on to satisfy her mind. "What did you do yesterday?" "I was at Norster all day. I went easily. By the way, here is the ribbon you wanted. I think it's exactly the same as the pattern." As he spoke, he took a tissue paper parcel from his pocket and handed it to her. "Thanks," she said. "Did you meet any friends there?" "Not many," he answered guardedly. He had a secret to keep. "Where did you dine?" "At the club." He began to be uneasy at this questioning, but he did not see any way to avoid answering without creating some suspicion. "Did you see anyone you knew at the club?" Her voice, as she spoke, was a little harder, a little more strained. Harold noticed the change, rather by instinct than reason. He felt that there was danger in it, and paused. The pause seemed to suddenly create a new fury in the breast of Stephen. She felt that Harold was playing with her. Harold! If she could not trust him, where then was she to look for trust in the world? If he was not frank with her, what then meant his early coming, his seeking her in the grove, his proposal of marriage, which seemed so sudden and so inopportune? He must have seen Leonard, and by some means have become acquainted with her secret of shame. His motive. Here her mind halted. She knew as well as if it had been trumpeted from the skies that Harold knew all, but she must be certain. She was standing erect, her hands held down by her sides and clenched together till her knuckles were white, all her body strung high like an over-pitched violin. Now she raised her right hand and flung it downward with a passionate jerk. "Answer me," she cried imperiously. "Answer me. Why are you playing with me? Did you see Leonard Everard last night? Answer me. I say, Harold and Wolfe, you do not lie. Answer me." As she spoke, Harold grew cold. From the question, he now knew that Stephen had guessed his secret. The fat was in the fire with a vengeance. He did not know what to do, and still remained silent. She did not give him time to think, but spoke again, this time more coldly. The white terror had replaced the red. "Are you not going to answer me a simple question, Harold? To be silent now is to wrong me. I have a right to know." In his trouble, for he felt that, say what he would, he could only give her new pain, he said humbly, "Don't ask me, Stephen. Won't you understand that I want to do what is best for you? Won't you trust me?" Her answer came harshly. A more experienced man than Harold, one who knew women better, would have seen how overwrought she was, and would have made pity the pivot of his future bearing and acts and words while the interview lasted, pity and pity only. But to Harold, the high ideal was ever the same. The Stephen whom he loved was no subject for pity, but for devotion only. He knew the nobility of her nature, and must trust it to the end. When her silence and her blazing eyes denied his request, he answered her query in a low voice. "I did." Even whilst he spoke, he was thankful for one thing. He had not been pledged in any way to confidence. Leonard had forced the knowledge on him, and though he would have preferred 1,000,000 times over to be silent, he was still free to speak. Stephen's next question came more coldly still. "Did he tell you of his meeting with me?" "He did." "Did he tell you all?" It was torture to him to answer, but he was at the stake and must bear it. "I think so. If it was true." "What did he tell you?" "Stay. I shall ask you the facts myself, the broad facts. We need not go into details." "Oh, Stephen." She silenced his pleading with an imperious hand. "If I can go into this matter, surely you can. If I can bear the shame of telling, you can at least bear that of listening. Remember that knowing what you know, or at least what you have heard, you could come here and propose marriage to me." This she said with a cold, cutting sarcasm, which sounded like the rasping of a roughly sharpened knife through raw flesh. Harold groaned in spirit. He felt a weakness which began at his heart to still through him. It took all his manhood to bear himself erect. He dreaded what was coming, as of old the once tortured victim dreaded the coming torment of the rack. Chapter 15. The End of the Meeting. Stephen went on in her calm, cold voice. "Did he tell you that I had asked him to marry me?" Despite herself, as she spoke the words, a red tide dyed her face. It was not a flush. It was not a blush. It was a sort of flood which swept through her, leaving her in a few seconds whiter than before. Harold saw and understood. He could not speak. He lowered his head silently. Her eyes glittered more coldly. The madness that every human being may have once was upon her. Such a madness is destructive, and here was something more vulnerable than herself. "Did he tell you how I pressed him?" There was no red tide this time, nor ever again whilst the interview lasted. To bow in affirmation was insufficient. With an effort he answered. "I understood so." She answered with an icy sarcasm. "You understood so? Oh, I don't doubt he embellished the record with some of his own pleasantries. But you understood it, and that is sufficient." After a pause, she went on. "Did he tell you that he had refused me?" "Yes." Harold knew now that he was under the torture, and that there was no refusing. She went on, with a light laugh, which wrung his heart even more than her pain had done. Stephen, to laugh like that! And I have no doubt that he embellished that too, with some of his fine masculine witticisms. I understood myself that he was offended at my asking him. I understood it quite well. He told me so. Then, with feminine intuition, she went on. I dare say that before he was done, he said something kindly of the poor little thing that loved him so much, and that she had to break down all the bounds of modesty and decorum that had made the woman of her house honoured for 1,000 years. And you listened to him whilst he spoke. Oh, she quivered with her white-hot anger as the fierce heat in the heart of the furnace quivers. But her voice was cold again as she went on. But who could help loving him? Girls always did. It was such a beastly nuisance. You understood all that, I dare say, though perhaps he did not put it in such plain words. Then the scorn, which up to now had been imprisoned, turned on him, and he felt as though some hose of deathly chill was being played upon him. And yet you, knowing that only yesterday he had refused my pressing request that he should marry me, come to me, hot foot, in the early morning and ask me to be your wife. I thought such things did not take place, that men were more honourable or more considerate or more merciful, or at least I used to think so, till yesterday. No, till today. Yesterday's doings were my own doings, and I had to bear the penalty of them myself. I had come here to fight out by myself the battle of my shame. Here Harold interrupted her. He could not bear to hear Stephen use such a word in connection with herself. No, you must not say shame. There is no shame to you, Stephen. There can be none, and no one must say it in my presence. In her secret heart of hearts, she admired him for his words. She felt them at the moment sink into her memory, and knew that she would never forget the mastery of his face and bearing. But the blindness of rage was upon her, and it is of the essence of this white-hot anger that it preys not on what is beset in us, but on what is best. That, Harold felt deeply, was her opportunity to wound him more deeply than before. Even here, in the solitude which I had chosen as the battleground of my shame, you had need to come unasked, unthought of, when even lesser mind than yours, for you are no fool, would have thought to leave me alone. My shame was my own, I tell you, and I was learning to take my punishment. My punishment. Poor creatures that we are, we think our punishment will be what we would like best, to suffer in silence, and not to have spread abroad our shame. How she harped on that word, though she knew that every time she uttered it, it cut to the heart of the man who loved her. And yet you come right on top of my torture to torture me still more and illimitably. You come, you who alone had the power to intrude yourself on my grief and sorrow, power given you by my father's kindness. You come to me without warning, considerately, telling me that you knew I would be here because I had always come here when I had been in trouble. No, I do you an injustice. In trouble was not what you said, but that I had come when I had been in short frocks, and you came to tell me that you loved me. You thought, I suppose, that as I had refused one man, I would jump at the next that came along. I wanted a man. God, God, what have I done that such an affront should come upon me, and come, too, from a hand that should have protected me, if only in gratitude for my father's kindness? She was eyeing him keenly, with eyes that, in her unflinching anger, took in everything with the accuracy of sun-painting. She wanted to wound, and she succeeded. But Harold had nerves and muscles of steel, and when the call came to them, they answered. Though the pain of death was upon him, he did not flinch. He stood before her like a rock in all his great manhood, but a rock on whose summit the waves had cast the wealth of their foam, for his face was as white as snow. She saw and understood, but in the madness upon her, she went on trying new places and new ways to wound. You thought, I suppose, that this poor, neglected, despised, rejected woman, who wanted so much to marry that she couldn't wait for a man to ask her, would hand herself over to the first chance comer who threw his handkerchief to her, would hand over herself and her fortune. Oh, Stephen, how can you say such things? Think such things? The protest broke from him with a groan. His pain seemed to inflame her still further, to gratify her hate, and to stimulate her mad passion. Why did I ever see you at all? Why did my father treat you as a son, that when you had grown and got strong on his kindness, you could thus insult his daughter in the darkest hour of her pain and her shame? She almost choked with passion. There was now nothing in the whole world that she could trust. In the pause he spoke. Stephen, I never meant you harm. Oh, don't speak such wild words. They will come back to you with sorrow afterwards. I only meant to do you good. I wanted... Her anger broke out afresh. There, you speak it yourself. You only wanted to do me good. I was so bad that any kind of husband... Oh, get out of my sight. I wish to God I had never seen you. I hope to God I may never see you again. Go, go, go. This was the end. To Harold's honest mind, such words would have been impossible had not thoughts of truth lain behind them. That Stephen, his Stephen, whose image in his mind shut out every other woman in the world, past, present, and future, should say such things to anyone, that she should think such things, was to him a deadly blow. But that she should say them to him, utterance, even the utterance which speaks in the innermost soul, failed him. He had, in some way that he knew not, hurt, wounded, killed Stephen, for the fine part was gone from the Stephen that he had known and worshipped so long. She wished him gone. She wished she had never seen him. She hoped to God never to see him again. Life for him was over and done. There could be no more happiness in the world, no more wish to work, to live. He bowed gravely and without a word turned and walked away. Stephen saw him go, his tall form moving amongst the tree trunks, till finally it was lost in their massing. She was so filled with the tumult of her passion that she looked unmoved. Even the sense of his going did not change her mood. She raged to and fro amongst the trees, her movements getting quicker and quicker as her excitement began to change from mental to physical, till the fury began to exhaust itself. All at once she stopped, as though arrested by a physical barrier, and with a moan sank down in a helpless heap on the cool moss. Harold went from the grove as one seems to move in a dream. Little things and big were mixed up in his mind. He took note, as he went towards the town, by the byroads, of everything around him in his usual way, for he had always been one of those who notice unconsciously, or rather unintentionally. Long afterwards he could shut his eyes and recall every step of the way, from the spot where he had turned from Stephen to the railway station outside Norster, and on many and many such a time, when he opened them again, the eyelids were wet. He wanted to get away quickly, silently, unobserved. With the instinct of habitual thought, his mind turned Londonward. He met but a few persons, and those only courtiers. He saluted them in his usual cheery way, but did not stop to speak with any. He was about to take a single ticket to London when it struck him that this might look odd, so he asked for a return. Then his mind, being once more directed towards concealment of purpose, he sent a telegraph to his housekeeper, telling her that he was called away to London on business. It was only when he was far on his journey that he gave thought to ways and means, and took stock of his possessions. Before he took out his purse and pocket-book, he made up his mind that he would be content with what it was, no matter how little. He had left Normanstand and all belongings to it for ever, and was off to hide himself in whatever part of the world would afford him the best opportunity. Life was over. There was nothing to look forward to, nothing to look back at. The present was a living pain, whose lightest element was despair. As, however, he got further and further away, his practical mind began to work. He thought over matters so as to arrange in his mind how best he could dispose of his affairs, so to cause as little comment as might be, and to save the possibility of worry or distress of any kind to Stephen. Even then, in his agony of mind, his heart was with her. It was not the least among his troubles that he would have to be away from her when perhaps she would need him most. And yet, whenever he would come to this point in his endless chain of thought, he would have to stop for a while, overcome with such pain that his power of thinking was paralyzed. He would never, could never, be of service to her again. He had gone out of her life, as she had gone out of his life, though she never had, nor never could, out of his thoughts. It was all over, all the years of sweetness, of hope and trust, and satisfied and justified faith in each other had been wiped out by that last terrible, cruel meeting. Oh, how could she have said such things to him? How could she have thought them? And there she was now, in all the agony of her unrestrained passion. Well, he knew from his long experience of her nature how she must have suffered to be in such a state of mind, to have so forgotten all the restraints of her teaching and her life. Poor Stephen, fatherless now, as well as motherless, and friendless as well as fatherless. No one to claim her in the height of her wild, abnormal passion. No one to comfort her when the fit had passed. No one to sympathize with her for all that she had suffered. No one to help her build new and better hopes out of the wreck of her mad ideas. He would cheerfully have given his life for her. Only last night he was prepared to kill, which was worse than to die, for her sake. And now, to be far away, unable to help, unable even to know how she fared, and behind her, eternally, the shadow of that worthless man who had spurned her love and flouted her to a chance comer in his drunken delirium. It was too bitter to bear. How could God lightly lay such a burden on his shoulders, who had all his life tried to walk in sobriety and chastity and in all worthy and many ways? It was unfair. It was unfair. If he could do anything for her, anything, and so the unending whirl of thoughts went on. The smoke of London was dim on the horizon when he began to get back to practical matters. When the train drew up at Euston, he stepped from it as one to whom death would be a joyous relief. He went to a quiet hotel, and from there transacted by letter such business matters as were necessary to save pain and trouble to others. As for himself, he made up his mind, and he would go to Alaska, which he took to be one of the best places in the as yet uncivilized world for a man to lose his identity. As a security, at the start, he changed his name, and as John Robinson, which was not a name to attract public attention, he shipped as a passenger on the Scoriac from London to New York. The Scoriac was one of the great cargo boats which take a certain number of passengers. The few necessities which he took with him were chosen with an eye to utility in the frozen land which he sought. For the rest he knew nothing, nor did he care how or whither he went. His vague purpose was to cross to the American continent, to San Francisco, and there to take passage for the high latitudes north of the Yukon River. When Stephen began to regain consciousness, her first sensation was one of numbness. She was cold in the back, and her feet did not seem to exist, but her head was hot and pulsing, as though her brain were a living thing. Then her half-open eyes began to take in her surroundings. For another long spell, she began to wonder why all around her was green. Then came the inevitable process of reason. Trees. It is a wood. How did I come here? Why am I lying on the ground? All at once, wakened memory opened on her its floodgates and overwhelmed her with pain. With her hands pressed to her throbbing temples and her burning face close to the ground, she began to recall what she could of the immediate past. It all seemed like a terrible dream. By degrees her intelligence came back to its normal strength. And all at once, as does one suddenly wakened from sleep to the knowledge of danger, she sat up. Somehow, the sense of time elapsed made Stephen look at her watch. It was 12:30. As she had come into the grove immediately after breakfast, and as Harold had almost immediately joined her, and as the interview between them had been but short, she must have lain on the ground for more than 3 hours. She rose at once, trembling in every limb. A new fear began to assail her that she had been missed at home, and that someone might have come to look for her. Up to now, she had not been able to feel the full measure of pain regarding what had passed, but which would, she knew, come to her in the end. It was too vague as yet. She could not realize that it had really been. But the fear of discovery was immediate and must be guarded against without delay. As well as she could, she tidied herself and began to walk slowly back to the house, hoping to gain her own room unnoticed. That her general intelligence was awake was shown by the fact that, before she left the grove, she remembered that she had forgotten her sunshade. She went back and searched till she had found it. Gaining her room without meeting anyone, she at once changed her dress, fearing that some soil or wrinkle might betray her. Resolutely she put back from her mind all the consideration of the past. There would be time for that later on. Her nerves were already much quieter than they had been. That long faint or lapse into insensibility had for the time taken the place of sleep. There would be a price to be paid for it later, but for the present it had served its purpose. Now and again she was disturbed by one thought. She could not quite remember what had occurred after Harold had left, and just before she became unconscious. She dared not dwell upon it, however. It would doubtless all come back to her when she had leisure to think the whole matter over as a connected narrative. When the gong sounded for lunch, she went down with a calm exterior to face the dreaded ordeal of another meal. Luncheon passed off without a hitch. She and her aunt talked as usual over all the small affairs of the house and the neighbourhood, and the calm restraint was in itself soothing. Even then, she could not help feeling how much convention is to a woman's life. Had it not been for these reoccurring trials of set hours and duties, she could never have passed the last day and night without discovery of her condition of mind. That one terrible hysterical outburst was perhaps the safety valve. Had it been spread over the time occupied in conventional duties, its force, even then, might have betrayed her, but without the necessity of nerving herself to conventional needs, she would have inevitably betrayed herself by her negative condition. After lunch, she went to her own boudoir, where, when she had shut the inner door, no one was allowed to disturb her without some special need in the house or on the arrival of visitors. This sporting oak was the sign of not at home, which she had learned in her glimpse of college life. Here, in the solitude of safety, she began to go over the past resolutely and systematically. She had already been so often over the memory of the previous humiliating and unhappy day that she need not revert to it at present. Since then, had she not quarrelled with Harold, whom she had all her life so trusted that her quarrel with him seemed to shake the very foundations of her existence? As yet, she had not remembered perfectly all that had gone on under the shadow of the beech grove. She dared not face it all at once, even as yet. Time must elapse before she should dare to cry. To think of her loss of Harold was to risk breaking down altogether. Already she felt weak. The strain of the last 48 hours was too much for her physical strength. She began to feel, as she lay back in her cushioned chair, that a swoon is no worthy substitute for sleep. Indeed, it had seemed to make the need for sleep even more imperative. It was all too humiliating. She wanted to think over what had been, to recall it as far as possible, so as to fix it in her mind whilst it was still fresh. Later on, some action might have to be based on her recollection. And yet, how could she think when she was so tired? Nature came to the poor girl's relief at last, and she fell into a heavy sleep. It was like coming out of the grave to be dragged back to waking life out of such a sleep, and so soon after it had begun. But the voice seemed to reach to her inner consciousness in some compelling way. For a second she could not understand, but as she rose from the cushions, the maid's message repeated brought her wide awake and alert in an instant. "Mr. Everard, young Mr. Everard to see you, miss." Chapter 16. A Private Conversation. The name braced Stephen at once. Here was danger, an enemy to be encountered. All the fighting blood of generations leaped to the occasion. The short spell of sleep had helped to restore her. There remained still quite enough of mental and nervous excitement to make her think quickly. The words were hardly out of the maid's mouth before her resolution was taken. It would never do to let Leonard Everard see she was diffident about meeting him. She would go down at once, but she would take the precaution of having her aunt present, at any rate, till she should have seen how the land lay. Her being just waked from sleep would be an excuse for asking her aunt to see the visitor till she came down. So she said to the maid, "I have been asleep. I must have got tired walking in the wood in the heat. Ask Auntie to kindly see Mr. Everard in the blue drawing-room till I come down. I must tidy my hair, but I will be down in a few minutes. Shall I send Marjorie to you, miss?" "No, don't mind. I can do what I want myself. Hurry down to Miss Rowley." How she regarded Leonard Everard now was shown in her instinctive classing him amongst her enemies. When she entered the room, she seemed all aglow. She wanted not only to overcome but to punish, and all the woman in her had risen to the effort. Never in her life had Stephen Norman looked more radiantly beautiful, more adorable, more desirable. Even Leonard Everard felt his pulses quicken as he saw that glowing mass of beauty standing out against the cold background of old French tapestry. All the physical side of him leaped in answer to the call of her beauty, and even his cold heart and his self-engrossed brain followed with slower gait. He had been sitting opposite Miss Rowley in one of the windows, twirling his hat in nervous suspense. He jumped up, and, as she came towards him, went forward rapidly to greet her. No one could mistake the admiration in his eyes. Ever since he had made up his mind to marry her, she had assumed a new aspect in his thoughts, but now her presence swept away all false imaginings. From the moment that her loveliness dawned upon him, something like love began to grow within his breast. Stephen saw the look, and it strengthened her. He had so grievously wounded her pride the previous day that her victory on this was a compensation which set her more at her old poise. Her greeting was all sweetness. She was charmed to see him. How was his father, and what was the news? Miss Rowley looked on with smiling visage. She, too, had seen the look of admiration in his eyes, and it pleased her. Old ladies, especially when they are maiden ladies, always like to see admiration in the eyes of young men when they are turned in the direction of any girl dear to them. They talked for some time, keeping all the while by Stephen's clever generalship to the small talk of the neighbourhood and the minor events of social importance. As the time wore on, she could see that Leonard was growing impatient and evidently wanted to see her alone. She ignored, however, all his little private signalling and presently ordered tea to be brought. This took some little time when it had been brought and served and drunk. Leonard was in a smothered fume of impatience. She was glad to see that, as yet her aunt had noticed nothing, and she still hoped that she would be able to so prolong matters that she would escape without a private interview. She did not know the cause of Leonard's impatience, that he must see her before the day passed. She, too, was an egoist in her own way. In the flush of belief of his subjugation, she did not think of attributing to him any other motive than his desire for herself. As she had made up her mind on the final issue, she did not want to be troubled by any new scene. But, after all, Leonard was a man, and man's ways are more direct than women's. Seeing that he could not achieve his object in any other way, he said out suddenly, thinking, and rightly, that she would not wish to force an issue in the presence of her aunt. By the way, Miss Norman, he had always called her Miss Norman, in her aunt's presence, I want to have 2 minutes with you before I go, on a matter of business, he added, noticing Miss Rowley's surprised look. The old lady was old-fashioned, even for her age. In her time, no young man would have asked to see a young lady alone on business, except on one kind of business, and with regard to that kind of business, gentlemen had to obtain first the confidence and permission of guardians. Leonard saw the difficulty, and said quickly, "It is on the matter you wrote to me about." Stephen was prepared for a nasty shock, but hardly for so nasty a one as this. There was an indelicacy about it which went far beyond the bounds of thoughtless conventionality. That such an appeal should be made to her, and in such a way, savoured of danger. Her woman's intuition gave her the guard, and at once she spoke, smilingly and gently, as one recalling a matter in which the concern is not her own. "Of course, it was selfish of me not to have thought of it, and to have kept you so long waiting. The fact is, Auntie, that Leonard— I like to call him Leonard, since we were children together, and he is so young, though perhaps it would be more decorous nowadays to say Mr. Everard— has consulted me about his debts. You know, Auntie dear, that young men will be young men in such matters, or perhaps you do not, since the only person who ever worried you has been myself. But I stayed at Oxford, and I know something of young men's ways, and as I am necessarily more or less of a man of business, he values my help. Don't you, Leonard?" The challenge was so direct, and the position he was in so daringly put, that he had to acquiesce. Miss Rowley, who had looked on with a frown of displeasure, said coldly, "I know, you are your own mistress, my dear, but surely it would be better if Mr. Everard would consult with his solicitor, or his father's agent, or some of his gentleman friends, rather than with a young lady whose relations with him, after all, are only those of a neighbour on visiting terms. For my own part, I should have thought that Mr. Everard's best course would have been to consult his own father, but the things that gentlemen as well as ladies do have been sadly changed since my time." Then, rising in formal dignity, she bowed gravely to the visitor before leaving the room. But the position of being left alone in the room with Leonard did not at all suit Stephen's plans. Rising quickly, she said to her aunt, "Don't stir, Auntie. I dare say you are right in what you say, but I promised Mr. Everard to go into the matter, and as I have brought the awkwardness on myself, I suppose I must bear it. If Mr. Everard wants to see me alone, and I suppose he is diffident in speaking on such a matter before you, he didn't play with you, you know, we can go out on the lawn. We shan't be long." Before Leonard could recover his wits, she had headed him out on the lawn. Her strategy was again thoroughly good. The spot she had chose, though beyond earshot, was quite in the open and commanded by all the windows in the side of the house. A person speaking there might say what he liked, but his actions must be discreet. On the lawn, Stephen tripped ahead. Leonard followed inwardly, raging. By her clever use of the opening, she had put him in a difficulty from which there was no immediate means of extrication. He could not quarrel overtly with Stephen. If he did so, how could he enter in the pressing matter of his debts? He dared not openly proclaim his object in wishing to marry her, for had he done so, her aunts might have interfered. With what success, he could not be sure. In any case, it would cause delay, and delay was what he could not afford. He felt that in mentioning his debts at just such a movement, he had given Stephen the chance she had so aptly taken. He had to be on his good behaviour, however, and with an apprehension that was new to him, he followed her. An old Roman marble seat was placed at an angle from the house, so that the one of the two occupants within the curve must almost face the house, whilst the other gave to it at least a quarter face. Stephen seated herself on the near side, leaving to Leonard the exposed position. As soon as he was seated, she began. "Now, Leonard, tell me all about the debts." She spoke in tones of gay friendliness, but behind the mask of her cheerfulness was the real face of fear. Down deep in her mind was a conviction that her letter was a pivotal point of future sorrow. It was in the meantime quite apparent to her that Leonard kept it as his last resource, so her instinct was to keep it to the front and thus minimize its power. Leonard, though inwardly weakened by qualms of growing doubt, had the animal instinct that, as he was the opposition, his safety was in attacking where his opponent most feared. He felt that there was some subtle change in his companion. This was never the same Stephen Norman whom only yesterday he had met upon the hill. He plunged at once into his purpose. "But it wasn't about my debts you asked me to meet you, Stephen." "You surprise me, Leonard. I thought I simply asked you to come to meet me. I know the first subject I mentioned when we began to talk, after your grumbling about coming in the heat, was your money matters." Leonard winced, but went on. "It was very good of you, Stephen, but really, that is not what I came to speak of today. At first, at all events," he added with a sublime naivety, as the subject of his debts and his imperative want of money rose before him. Stephen's eyes flashed. She saw more clearly than ever through his purpose, such as admission at the very outset of the proffer of marriage, which she felt was coming, was little short of monstrous. Her companion did not see the look of mastery on her face. He was looking down at the moment. A true lover would have been looking up. "I wanted to tell you, Stephen, that I have been thinking over what you said to me in your letter and what you said in words, and I want to accept." As he was speaking, he was looking her straight in the face. Stephen answered slowly, with a puzzled smile which wrinkled up her forehead. "Accept what I said in my letter? Why, Leonard, what do you mean? That letter must have had a lot more in it than I thought. I seemed to remember that it was simply a line asking you to meet me. Just let me look at it. I should like to be sure of what actually is." As she spoke, she held out her hand. Leonard was nonplussed. He did not know what to say. Stephen made up her mind to have the letter back. Leonard was chafing under the position forced upon him, and tried to divert his companion from her purpose. He knew well why she had chosen that exposed position for their interview. Now, as her outstretched hand embarrassed him, he made reprisal. He tried to take it in his, in a tender manner. She instantly drew back her hand and put it behind her in a decided manner. She was determined that, whatever might happen, she would not let any watcher at the windows, by chance or otherwise, see any sign of tenderness on her part. Leonard, thinking that his purpose had been effected, went on, breathing more freely. "Your letter wasn't much, except, of course, that it gave me the opportunity of listening to what you said, to all your sweet words, to your more than sweet proposal." "Yes, it must have been sweet to have anyone who was in a position to do so offer to help you when you knew that you were overwhelmed with debts." The words were brutal, Stephen felt so. She had no alternative. Leonard had some of the hard side of human nature, but he had also some of the weak side. He went on blindly. "I have been thinking ever since of what you said, and I want to tell you that I would like to do as you wish." As he spoke, his words seemed even to him to be out of place. He felt it would be necessary to throw more fervour into the proceedings. The sudden outburst which followed actually amused Stephen, even in her state of fear. "Oh, Stephen, don't you know that I love you? You are so beautiful. I love you. I love you. Won't you be my wife?" This was getting too much, too close quarters. Stephen said in a calm, business-like way, "My dear Leonard, one thing at a time. I came out here, you know, to speak of your debts, and until that is done, I really won't go into any other matter. Of course, if you'd rather not—" Leonard really could not afford this. Matters were too pressing with him, so he tried to affect a cheery manner, but in his heart was a black resolve that she should yet pay for this. "All right, Stephen, whatever you wish, I will do. You are the queen of my heart, you know." "How much is the total amount?" said Stephen. This was a change to the prosaic which made sentiment impossible. He gave over for the time. "Go on," said Stephen, following up her advantage. "Don't you even know how much you owe?" "The fact is, I don't. Not exactly. I shall make up the amount as well as I can and let you know, but that's not what I came about today." Stephen was going to make an angry gesture of dissent. She was not going to have that matter opened up. She waited, however, for Leonard was going on after his momentary pause. She breathed more freely after his first sentence. He was unable, evidently, to carry on a double train of thought. "It was about that infernal money-lender's letter that the governor got." Stephen got still less anxious. This open acknowledgment of his true purpose seemed to clear the air. "What is the amount?" Leonard looked quickly at her. The relief of her mind made her tone seem joyful. "A monkey. £500, you know. But then there's 300 for interest. That has to be paid also. It's an awful lot of money, isn't it?" The last phrase was added on seeing Stephen's surprised look. "Yes," she answered quietly. "A great deal of money to waste." They were both silent for a while. Then she said, "What does your father say to it?" "He was in an awful wax. One of these beastly duns had written to him about another account, and he was in a regular fury. When I told him I would pay it within a week, he said very little, which was suspicious. And then, just when I was going out, he sprung this on me. Mean of him, wasn't it? I need expect no help from him." As he was speaking, he took a mass of letters from his pocket and began to look among them for the moneylender's letter. "Why, what a correspondence you have there! Do you keep all your letters in your pockets?" said Stephen quietly. "All I don't tear up or burn. It wouldn't do to let the governor into my secrets. He might know too much." "And are all those letters from Duns?" "Mostly, but I only keep those letters I have to attend to, and those I care for." "Show me the bundle," she said. Then, seeing him hesitate, added, "You know, if I'm to help you to get clear, you must take me into your confidence. I dare say I shall have to see a lot more letters than these before you are quite clear." Her tone was too quiet. Knowing already the silent antagonism between them, he began to suspect her. Knowing also that her own letter was not amongst them, he used his wits and handed them over without a word. She, too, suspected him. After his tacit refusal to give her the letter, she almost took it for granted that it was not amongst them. She gave no evidence of her feeling, however, but opened and read the letters in due sequence, all save two which, being a female hand, she gave back without a word. There was a calmness and an utter absence of concern, much less of jealousy, about this which disconcerted him. Throughout her reading, Stephen's face showed surprise now and again, but when she came to the last, which was that of the ushers, it showed alarm. Being a woman, a legal threat had certain fears of its own. "There must be no delay about this," she said. "What am I to do?" he answered, a weight of his mind that the fiscal matter had been practically entered on. "I shall see that you get the money," she said quietly. "It will be really a gift, but I prefer it to be a loan for many reasons." Leonard made no comment. He found so many reasons in his own mind that he thought it wise to forbear from asking any of hers. Then she took the practical matter in hand. "You must wire to these people at once to say that you will pay the amount on the day after tomorrow. If you will come here tomorrow at 4 o'clock, the money will be ready for you. You can go up to town by the evening train and pay off the debt first thing in the morning. When you bring the receipt, I shall speak to you about the other debts, but you must make out a full list of them. We can't have any half measure. I will not go into the matter until I have all the details before me." Then she stood up to go. As they walked across the lawn, she said, "By the way, don't forget to bring that letter with you. I want to see what I really did say in it." Her tone was quiet enough, and the wording was a request, but Leonard knew as well as if it had been spoken outright as a threat that if he did not have the letter with him when he came, things were likely to be unpleasant. The farther he got from Normanstand on his way home, the more discontented Leonard grew. Whilst he had been in Stephen's presence, she had so dominated him, not only by her personality, but by her use of her knowledge of his own circumstances, that he had not dared to make a protest or opposition. But now he began to feel how much less he was to receive than he had expected. He had come prepared to allow Stephen to fall into his arms, fortune and all. But now, although he had practical assurance that the weight of his debts would be taken from him, he was going away with his tail between his legs. He had not even been accepted as a suitor, he who had himself been wooed only a day before. His proposal of marriage had not been accepted, had not even been considered by the woman who had so lately broken ironclad convention to propose marriage to him. He had been treated merely as a scapegrace debtor who had come to ask favours from an old friend. He had even been treated like a bad boy, had been told that he had wasted money, had been ordered in no doubtful way to bring the full schedule of his debts. And all the time he dared not say anything, lest the thing shouldn't come off at all. Stephen had such an infernally masterly way with her. It didn't matter whether she was proposing to him or he was proposing to her. He was made to feel small all the same. He would have to put up with it till he had got rid of the debts. And then, as to the letter, why was she so persistent about seeing it? Did she want to get it into her hands and then keep it, as Harold and Wolfe had done? Was it possible that she suspected he would use it to coerce her? She would call it blackmail, he supposed. This being the very thing he had intended to do, and had done. He grew very indignant at the very thought of being accused of it. It was, he felt, a very awkward thing that he had lost possession of the letter. He might need it if Stephen got nasty. Then Harold might give it to her, as he had threatened to do. He thought he would call round that evening by Harold's house and see if he couldn't get back the letter. It belonged to him. Harold had no right to keep it. He would see him before he and Stephen got putting their heads together. So, on his way home, he turned his steps at once to Harold's house. He did not find him in. The maid who opened the door could give him no information. All she could say was that Mr. Dingle, the housekeeper, had got a telegram from Master saying that he had been called suddenly away on business. This was a new source of concern to Leonard. He suspected a motive of some sort, though what that motive could be he could not hazard the wildest guess. On his way home, he called at the post office and sent a telegram to Cavendish and Cecil, the name of the usher's firm, in accordance with Stephen's direction. He signed it Jasper Everard. Chapter 17. A Business Transaction. When Stephen had sent off her letter to the bank, she went out for a stroll. She knew it would be no use trying to get rest before dinner. That ordeal, too, had to be gone through. She found herself unconsciously going into the direction of the grove, but when she became aware of it, a great revulsion overcame her, and she shuddered. Slowly she took her way across the hard stretch of finely kept grass which lay on the side of the house, away from the wood. The green sward lay like a sea, dotted with huge trees singly, or in clumps as islands. In the far-stretching state lines there was something soothing. She came back to the sound of the dressing gong with a better strength to resist the trial before her. Well, she knew her aunt would have something to say on the subject of her interference in Leonard Everard's affairs. Her fears were justified, for when they had come into the drawing-room after dinner, Miss Rowley began, "Stephen, dear, is it not unwise of you to interfere in Mr. Everard's affairs?" "Why unwise, auntie?" "Well, my dear, the world is censorious, and when a young lady of your position and your wealth takes a part in a young man's affairs, tongues are apt to wag. And also, dear, debts. Young men's debts are hardly the subject for a girl's investigation. Remember that we ladies live very different lives from men, from some men. I should say, for your dear father was the best of men, and I should think that in all his life there was nothing he would have wished concealed. But, my dear, young men are less restrained in their ways than we have to be for our own safety and protection." The poor lady was greatly perturbed at having to speak in such a way. Stephen saw her distress. Coming over to her, she sat down and took her hand. Stephen had a very tender side to her nature, and she loved very truly the dear old lady who had taken her mother's place and had shown her all a mother's love. Now, in her loneliness and woe and fear, she clung to her in spirit. She would have liked to have clung to her physically, to have laid her head on her bosom, and have cried her heart out. The time for tears had not come. Hourly she felt more and more the weight that a shameful secret is to carry. She knew, however, that she could set her aunt's mind at rest on the present subject, so she said, "I think you are right, Auntie dear. It would have been better if I had asked you first, but I saw that Leonard was in distress, and I wormed the cause of it from him. When I heard that it was only debt, I offered to help him. He is an old friend, you know, Auntie. We were children together, and as I have much more money than I can ever want or spend, I thought I might help him. I am afraid I have let myself in for a bigger thing than I intended, but as I have promised, I must go on with it. I dare say, Auntie, that you are afraid that I may end up getting in love with him and marrying him, don't you, dear?" This was said with a hug and a kiss, which gave the old lady delight. Her instinct told her what was coming. She nodded her head in acquiescence. Stephen went on, gravely, "Put any such fear out of your mind. I shall never marry him. I can never love him." She was going to say, "Could never love him," when she remembered. "Are you sure, my dear? The heart is not always under one's own control." "Quite sure, Auntie. I know Leonard Everard, and though I have always liked him, I do not respect him. Why, the very fact of his coming to me for money would make me reconsider any view I had formed, had nothing else ever done so. You may take it, Auntie dear, that in the way you mean, Leonard is nothing to me, can never be anything to me." Here a sudden inspiration took her. In its light a serious difficulty passed, and the doing of the thing which had a fear of its own became easy, with a conviction in her tone, which in itself aided her immediate purpose. She said, "I shall prove it to you. That is, if you will not mind doing something which will save me an embarrassment." "You know I will do anything, my dearest, which an old woman can do for a young one." Stephen squeezed the mittened hand which she had as she went on. "As I said, I have promised to lend him some money. The first instalment is to be given him tomorrow. He is to call for it in the afternoon. Will you give it to him for me?" "Gladly, my dear," said the old lady, much relieved. Stephen continued, "One other thing, Auntie, I want you to do for me. Not to think of the amount or to say a word to me about it. It is a large sum, and I dare say it will frighten you a little, but I have made up my mind to it. I am learning a great deal out of this, Auntie dear, and I am quite willing to pay for my knowledge. After all, money is the easiest and cheapest way of paying for knowledge. Don't you agree with me?" Miss Rowley gulped down her disappointment. She felt that she ought not to say too much. Now that Stephen had set aside her graver fears, she consoled herself with the thought that even a large amount of money would cause no inconvenience to so wealthy a woman as Stephen. Beyond this, as she would have the handling over of the money to Leonard, she would know the amount. If advisable, she could remonstrate. She could, if necessary, consult in confidence with Harold. Her relief from her greater fear and her gladness at the new proof of her niece's confidence were manifested in the extra affection with which she bade her good night. Stephen did not dare to breathe freely till she was quite alone, and, as she lay quiet in her bed, in the dark, she thought before sleep came. Her first feeling was one of thankfulness that immediate danger was swerving from her. Things were so shaping themselves that she need not have any fear concerning Leonard. For his own sake he would have to keep silent. If he intended to blackmail her, she would have the protection of her aunt's knowledge of the loan, and her participation in it. The only weapon that remained to him was her letter, and that she would get from him before furnishing the money for the payment of his other debts. These things out of the way, her thoughts turned to the matter of the greater dread, that of which all along she had feared, to think for a moment, Harold, and her treatment of him. The first reception of the idea was positive anguish. From the moment he had left her till now, there had been no time when a consideration of the matter was possible. Time pressed, or circumstances had interfered, or her own personal condition had forbidden. Now, when she was alone, the whole awful truth burst on her like an avalanche. Stephen felt the issue of her thinking before the thinking itself was accomplished, and it was with a smothered groan that she, in the darkness, held up her arms with fingers linked in desperate concentration of appeal. Oh, if she could only take back 1 hour of her life! Well, she knew what that hour would be. Even that shameful time with Leonard on the hilltop seemed innocuous beside the degrading remembrance of her conduct to the noble friend of her whole life. Sadly, she turned over in her bed, and with shut eyes put her burning face on the pillow, to hide, as it were, from herself her abject depth of shame. Leonard lounged through the next morning with what patience he could. At 4 o'clock he was at the door of the Norman stand in his dog-cart. This time he had a groom with him and a suitcase packed for a night's use, as he was to go on to London after his interview with Stephen. He had lost sight altogether of the matter of Stephen's letter, or else he would have been more nervous. He was taken into the blue drawing-room, where shortly Miss Rowley joined him. He had not expected this. His mental uneasiness manifested itself in his manner, and his fidgeting was not unobserved by the astute old lady. He was disconcerted, overwhelmed, would better have described his feelings when she said, "Miss Norman is sorry she can't see you today, as she is making a visit, but she has given me a message for you, or rather a commission to discharge. Perhaps you had better sit down at this table. There are writing materials there, and I shall want a receipt of some sort. Stephen did not say anything about a receipt." The other smiled sweetly as she said in a calm way, "But unfortunately, Miss Norman is not here, and so I have to do the best I can. I really must have some proof that I have fulfilled my trust. You see, Mr. Everard, though it is what lawyers call a friendly transaction, it is more or less a business act, and I must protect myself." Leonard saw that he must comply, for time pressed. He sat down at the table, taking up a pen and drawing a sheet of paper towards him. He said with what command of his voice he could, "What am I to write?" The old lady took from her basket a folded sheet of notepaper, and, putting on her reading glasses, said as she smoothed it out, "I think it would be well to say something like this. I, Leonard Everard of Brindhower, in the parish of Normanstand, in the county of Norster, hereby acknowledge the receipt from Miss Letitia Rowley of £900 sterling, lent to me in accordance with my request, the same being to clear me of pressing debt due by me." When he had finished writing the receipt, Miss Rowley looked it over, and, handing it back to him, said, "Now, sign the date." He did so with suppressed anger. She folded the document carefully and put it in her pocket. Then, taking from a little pouch which she wore at her belt a roll of notes, she counted out on the table 9 notes of £100 each. As she put down the last, she said, "Miss Norman asked me to say that £100 is added to the sum you specified to her, as doubtless the ushers would, since you are actually behind the time promised for payment, require something extra as a solatium or to avoid legal proceedings already undertaken. In fact, they would put more salt on your tail. The expression, I regret to say, is not mine." Leonard folded up the notes, put them into his pocket-book, and walked away. He did not feel like adding verbal thanks to the document already signed. As he got near the door, the thought struck him. Turning back, he said, "May I ask if Stephen said anything about getting the document?" "I beg your pardon," she said, icily. "Did you speak of anyone?" "Miss Norman, I meant." Miss Rowley's answer to this came so smartly that it left an added sting. Her arrow was fledged with 2 feathers, so that it must shoot true, her distrust of him, and his own impotence. "Oh no, Miss Norman knows nothing of this. She simply asked me to give you the money. This is my own doing entirely. You see, I must exercise my judgment on my dear niece's behalf. Of course, it may not be necessary to show her the receipt, but if it should ever be advisable, it is always there." He looked at her with anger, not unmixed with admiration, as, bowing rather lower than necessary, he went out of the door, saying, "Sotto voce," between his teeth. "When my turn comes out to you, neck and crop. Quick! Normanstand isn't big enough to hold us both."